Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Adventures in Historyland YouTube channel. Tonight, we are delighted to have as our guest Kristine Hughes Patrone of the blog Number One London. She is an author and an excellent tour guide of Regency London. And she is coming to us tonight all the way from sunny Florida. Kristine, great to have you.
Nice to be here, Josh.
We've been in contact for actually a very long time.
We have.
We're both huge Duke of Wellington fans. Wellington, who you affectionately call Artie.
After 30 years, I think I'm...
I think after 30 years, he would have allowed you to call him Artie. But nevertheless, it sounds much better when an American says it than I say it. It's so much more friendlier and warmer when an American says Artie, and when I say it, it just sounds
Artie. Yep, yeah. Artie.
Tonight we are talking about the Duke of Wellington in a way, because we're not at the same time, if that makes sense, which it doesn't, because we're actually talking about some of the ladies in the Duke of Wellington's life. But not the ones you always hear about.
Not the usual suspects.
We've had enough of them. You can take your Harriet Wilsons, Webb and Websters, even the Duchess of Wellington, even Kitty, even poor old Kitty.
Poor old Kitty.
We hear about them all the time. All of the people he apparently had affairs with. All of the people who wrote things about him. I don't think, we might not even be giving a great deal of time to the lesser known and more spoken about people like Harriet Arbuthnot, who people know about. Of course, right. she's going to be included, of course, because she is not one of the leading ladies that you hear about all the time.
Absolutely.
But there are others, aren't there? There are others.
Many others. Many others who really influenced his life, and through whom you really get a sense of the integrity of the man. And, you know, the friendships that he cherished and really held lifelong. If you got to be his friend, you were his friend come what may.
To the death. And the great many of his closest friends were actually women.
Yes.
And I'm not talking about mistresses here. I'm talking about his best friends, the people he would actually confide things to, the people he wanted to talk to when he had something on his mind. And that is why.
Well, you know, Harriet and Charles.
Yeah.
There's decades there where after sitting in Parliament or doing whatever he did all day, he went home to them, to their house, and had dinner and discussed the day's events. And that was a regular thing. You know, and ask their advice, and what do you think I should say to this one, or about this, or how do you think and he really valued her opinion.
He did. One of the most interesting things people will find out about Wellington is that when he stopped being a soldier, professionally, yes, his longest friendships are mostly women, and he would, if he loved to talk to intelligent women. Yes. He attached himself to many more, I think, intelligent women than men in a close proximity. You know, people who, outside of his military family, I think the majority of people he confided in and liked to spend time with were women that he found particularly intriguing, who he thought were maybe as intelligent as he was.
Yeah, and he's one of the few people of that era who allowed that women could be that intelligent, that women were, you know, on the same playing field as men, and he was, you know, never in doubt of that, and always made his preference for women who were strong and had big personalities.
And he allowed them to sort of dominate him in a sort of way. He called.
Absolutely, he was at the beck and call of Lady Shelley and Harriet Arbuthnot.
Yeah, he called her the tyrant. referring.
And that's a very sad story because,
yes,
Lady Shelley was on the same plane as Harriet Arbuthnot as far as being a confidant.
Mm.
But then she kind of showed, she showed one of his letters to somebody before he was ready to have it shown. And it got back to him, and that was it.
Yes.
That was the death knell.
And that's a good example of what you can learn by looking at these women in his life. You learn more about him through instances like that, because we just said he sought out very intelligent, very strong women who could stand up to him and beat him in a conversation, basically, hold their own with him in a conversation, which was a very difficult thing to do for anybody.
Yes.
But he was a very private man, and so you had to respect that about him. You couldn't go around saying, I'm best friends with the Duke of Wellington, look what he wrote me. And that, right. Crossing a line. Harriet Arbuthnot would never do that.
Right.
And that's why he loved it.
Also, when people say, try to infer that there was something more between the Duke and Harriet. And, everybody who knows anything, as far as Longford, Rory Muir, people who have really taken the whole bulk of material about Wellington and weighed it out and have the big picture, it's absurd because he was as good friends with Harriet as he was with Charles, who, after Harriet's death, spent the rest of his life with the Duke.
Yeah, they both Harriet and Wellington both loved Charles. They were both she loved him as a wife, and he loved him as his best friend.
Correct.
Both reasons why nothing was ever going to happen.
Correct. And he gave her very important gifts every birthday. He spent Wellington was, no surprise, very regimented.
Yeah.
So after the army, even, his social calendar for the year was the same every year. The beaver hunt and this and that, and Easter with you and Christmas with you. And every day, every birthday of Harriet's, he went to Woodford with them and spent, at least a couple of days. But the important thing is that he gave her important gifts every year, like emeralds and, really expensive things. And one year he couldn't, so he gave the gift to Charles and said, here, you give it to Harriet. So, it wasn't like this, behind the scenes gift giving thing.
Yeah.
It implied nothing because if you know anything about Wellington, he was not the kind of man who was going to cuckold his best friend.
No.
It's absurd.
He had no particular qualms about hanging out and flirting with married women particularly, but friendship was a big deal with Wellington. So the Harriet Arbuthnot rumor, which to be fair was current in some circles at the time because they were very close and people just assumed that they must be having an affair. It's just absurd. And there's some people who just throw it about on TV. That she was his mistress. I just slump into my seat.
I know. You slump. Imagine me.
You probably get up and storm out of the room.
Well, I'm Wellington's biggest champion. Yeah. So anytime I hear something that's so off the wall, I can't. It's just I can't
deal with it. Well, that's Harriet Arbuthnot, and that's what we can learn from learning about the women that he chose to surround himself with. Now, one of the women we're going to talk about tonight, in as much detail as we possibly can, for you lovely people who have shown up to watch, is Lady Anne Wellesley, who is his sister. Now, yes. For a start, just for a start, except for his brother Richard and maybe Henry or Gerald, you don't really hear about his siblings at all, and least of all, you hear about his sisters. He came from quite a large family. He had how many siblings did he have? Was it 7 or 8?
Well, there's some kind of controversy here because some camps say that there was a second sister. Do you know this story? There was a second sister that had something wrong with her?
Yes.
Some disability?
I had heard, yes, yeah.
Yeah. So, but again, I don't know if that's true or not. So.
No, I don't know if it's true or not. I did read somewhere that there was a second sister and there was something wrong with her, and that's why you don't hear anything about it.
Mary, I think her name was.
It could be. It could be. But he came from a large family anyway, and that means with quite a few, certainly a lot of brothers. And Lady Anne, I mean, she doesn't have a great presence in most biographies of Wellington. Not a lot of people talk about her very much. Is she the one? No, she didn't. No, I'm getting mixed up with his sister-in-law who Uxbridge ran off with, or something,
right.
Isn't it?
Well, I always get her mixed up with Lady Anne Abdy, who was Richard's daughter.
Right. Yeah, because as we were saying just before we came on here, the Wellesley family is ridiculously intricate and quite large, and with a lot of people.
I call it incestuous.
Yeah.
You know, not in the usual sense, but everybody knew everybody or married into everybody's family or whatever the case may be.
Mm-hmm. It's terribly confusing. There is a book.
You have all the Wellesley Poles.
Oh, right, yeah.
You know, and that's a kerfuffle.
It's very confusing. But what's interesting about Lady Anne? Why don't you tell us a little bit about Lady Anne? What do you think is interesting about Lady Anne?
Well, first of all, Lady Anne was married to Henry Fitzroy, who was in Lisbon. I don't know why.
I don't think anybody does.
But he died there of consumption in 1794. So she was left alone there, a widow. And Henry, brother Henry, who was in the army at the time, got a leave of absence in order to go over to Lisbon and pick up his sister and escort her home. Now, on the voyage home, they get kidnapped by French pirates who are flying a British flag. Mm-hmm. And then when their ship gets closer, they take that down and run up the French flag. Mm-hmm. Well, it turns out that Henry and Anne were prisoners of the French for almost a year.
Mm-hmm. But not many people know that.
No, and not many people know the fact that the embargo between France and England was ending sometime in 1795. So Henry got whoever the grand poobah of the French at this prison was, mm-hmm. He convinced him to let the women prisoners go. And Henry says to the Frenchman, I will escort the ladies from here to whatever port it was, to the ship, so that they could be returned to England. Mm-hmm. And the Frenchman is like, yeah, okay. And Henry says, no, really, you have my word of honor that I'll come back. And he did.
He did. This is parole.
The English captain of the ship, when Henry delivers the ladies to him, says to him, are you nuts? Get on board. And Henry says, no, I gave him my word. He went back and then he snuck out like 2 days later. but he's fulfilled his promise to come back.
That is brilliant. That is brilliant. I love Henry now a lot for that. I have it written down here. Would that be Jean Bon Saint-André?
Okay.
The gentleman, so. the people's representative.
Yes.
Yeah. Who I have written down here said something. They say something very, very kind of witty about him, saying they gave us the Republican treatment or something like that when they were captured. It's a dangerous thing to be at sea in those days if you weren't in a convoy of something. As Henry,
threatening to be at sea.
Indeed.
Even crossing the channel.
I don't think that they could have been in a man of war to do this by the looks of it, or Yeah, it's just in a packet. They were just in a packet ship, so just a mail ship, really. And this French frigate takes them. And the rules, basically, of war at sea is if you're in a tiny ship and a frigate tells you to surrender, you surrender pretty much because they can blow you out of the water. This is a common privateer's trick. This business of the French of the flag. Yeah, false colours, running under false colours. And this was a time when the French privateers were particularly active in the English Channel. The most famous, I think, is a chap called Robert Surcouf, who had some very witty one-liners to say to some British captains that he managed to take. But I don't think he's involved in this. I'm sure it would have been mentioned if Robert Surcouf had taken Henry Wellesley.
Probably.
But that's a brilliant example of the parole system and the honor system at work there amongst.
I mean, talk about, a man's word is his bond.
It's just brilliant that he he then escaped 2 days later because he didn't promise anymore.
Correct. I know.
Great. So what did Lady Anne get up to once she got out of this very interesting situation? I mean, it was so fascinating. It was so fascinating to find out what she did in France and where she stayed and things like that. But
so she comes back to England and she marries again. But she had a daughter with Henry Fitzroy. She got married again. She had another daughter with the new husband, who was Charles Cullen Smith. Welcome to the wonderful world of Wellington. So Anne goes on to marry Charles Cullen Smith.
Right.
So the daughter that she had with Fitzroy.
Who died in Portugal.
Yes, that's Georgina.
Right.
And she marries the Marquis of Worcester, who at one time was Artie's ADC.
Yes, and this is Major Henry Somerset, who became the 7th Duke of Beaufort.
Right.
Interestingly, he is the nephew of Wellington's military secretary, Sir Fitzroy Somerset, who later became Lord Raglan, who commanded the British Army in the Crimean War.
Yes.
And he was one of Wellington's good friends. But we're not talking about Sir Fitzroy Somerset. We're talking about this guy here, and we're talking about Lady Anne.
So Georgina goes to, this is Wellington's niece. Apparently at one time, the Marquis of Worcester had a lot of debts, to the point where debt collectors were at his house going through all his effects because they were going to auction them off to raise the money. So at the time, they were living with the Duke at Apsley House, or else they would have had no place to live. Is a contemporary made that comment. I don't know if it's true or not, but anyway. So they all go to a ball at Carlton House. And afterwards, this is what they attribute it to, is after the hot dancing at Carlton House, she came home and took a bath, Georgina did, and then got very ill. And she should never have taken that bath. What a silly girl. Well, this is days now. I don't know if she had pneumonia or consumption or whatever, but she's lingering in death at Apsley House. And another contemporary says there were like 40 people in the room when she died, which I don't think there's a bedroom at Apsley House that would hold 40 people around a bed. I could be wrong. But apparently some of the biggest, wailingest women who were there, Wellington had to physically take them out and say, you're not allowed to go back in there. You're too hysterical. Stop it. So she dies at Apsley House. And then afterwards, several years afterwards, Worcester marries her half-sister. And Lady Anne, Wellington's sister, is fine with that. Wellington isn't, because it's against the law.
Yes.
Now, it's against the law to the point where if somebody wanted to make a big deal of it, they could. Most people would look the other way and the law would say nothing. But Wellington, being a stickler for right and wrong, and supposedly that's the wedge that came between Wellington and Sister Anne.
So that is she's obviously got a very interesting life, and it is one of those, it's almost an ordinary and at the same time extraordinary break that he has with his sister. I mean, he had rather difficult relations with a lot of his siblings, I think. But yeah, and I think also and we're always fair to Wellington on this channel, but to be fair to Wellington, it's not just that he wants things done properly. He knows that he probably knows that the chances for this girl's happiness are much improved with a better match than this person who 2
years before had the debt collectors at his door.
And they could, and the marriage being absolutely, well, pretty much illegal. So it could be annulled, and terrible things could happen, basically. And so,
but I mean, look at all the legal battles that, ancillary legal battles that Wellington eventually got involved in. The Wellesley poles and the long Tilney, long pole Wesley, that whole thing.
Yeah. And what's interesting, what is interesting about this instance is it kind of leads into some of the things that Wellington will be asked to get up to. He's been asked essentially for his blessing of this marriage, and he got asked for a lot of blessings in his life from family members and friends and things like that, even to the point, and not just that, but sort of specialist kind of missions, if you like, for royalty. For instance, the handling of certain documents, and after certain people died, that he had to go and solve.
For how many people was Wellington the executor? It's countless. And, one of them was George IV. So after he died, it fell to Wellington, and I believe Knighton was also, I think there was 4 executors on that will. And it fell to Wellington to go through essentially George IV's closets and wardrobe, because, he had a lot of billet-doux given to him from various women, and a lot of, very sensitive letters, memos, notes, whatever. So Wellington went through it with the other 3 executors, and he had these pocketbooks, which I'm supposing was what we would call a wallet.
Yeah.
And, somebody said that George IV had, an abundant number of these wallets. And when one filled up, he would throw it in his closet and get a new one and fill that up. And
never look at it again, apparently.
Never look at it again. So, Wellington's looking through these and saying it's a lot of rubbish. And, he's throwing it aside, ready to never look at it again. And out of one falls money, like cash money. And then it turns out, I think at the end, there was like 10,000 pounds that they uncovered.
Yeah.
So, but
for some reason, people have been giving the king and prince money, and he just,
I don't know. Or, maybe he had a couple of pounds in his purse in case he needed to make a phone call. I don't know.
Something like that.
Some cash.
Yeah.
So after this, Knighton had control of all George IV's correspondence. Whatever was, left in the archives, and a lot of it was sensitive, as far as mistresses, Mrs. Fitzherbert, the Cunninghams, that whole thing.
Yeah.
So Mrs. Fitzherbert, who didn't like Knighton and Knighton didn't like her, Knighton didn't like a lot of people, and a lot of people didn't like him. But anyway,
This is why they needed Wellington, by the way, everybody. Because
well, she started getting antsy about, what Knighton was going to do with this material in his possession. Well, then it got turned around to Mrs. Fitzherbert. Well, but you have all of Georgia Forth's letters to you. Mm-hmm. So, we have to come to some agreement. And of course, it fell to Wellington to approach her and say, look, let's do a deal here. If Knighton gives up your letters to Georgia Forth, will you give up his letters to you? And in the end, she agreed. And literally, they sat around at her fireplace in London and burnt one by one all of these, letters on both sides. She kept the marriage certificate, and she kept 2 or 3 special letters, and they were deposited at Coutts Bank under a seal, and weren't supposed to be opened until the year whatever. I don't have it off the top of my head. Yeah. However, before that could happen, the royal family took them, and they are now in the archives at Windsor, still under seal, supposedly. So
there'll doubtless be an announcement sometime in the years to come of some great release or something like that, like George III's letters or something. But interesting you should bring up Coutts Bank, because actually that brings up another lady who played quite an important role in his life, the Duke of Wellington's life when he was an older man.
Yes.
And that is Angela Bernadette Coutts, is it? Burdett Coutts, thank you. Angela Burdett Coutts.
One of the richest women in England at the time.
One of the richest and best women in London by common consent.
Yes, she did a lot of charitable work.
She was ridiculously wealthy, and like many wealthy people in many movies, she wanted to do good with this gift that she had been born with. And she spent her life doing good deeds.
Well, when she got control or was on the board of Coutts Bank, she really didn't know what was going on. She didn't have that background. So she would come home daily to the Duke, who by this time they were very good friends. And he advised her on a lot of things. And he advised her a lot with Coutts Bank, how to proceed with the board, what kind of demeanor and appearance she wanted to project to them, what she should ask for, what she shouldn't ask for. And he explained a lot of things to her that, were over her head because she hadn't been in that field before. She got, pretty quickly she got up to speed, but at a time when she needed him, he was there for her.
Yes.
And at the same time, her charitable works, another very good friend of hers was Charles Dickens.
Wow, I didn't know that actually. I knew she was incredibly well connected, and that she became this Victorian icon of kind of good deeds and Christian morality and things like that.
Well, it started out that she and Charles Dickens did a lot of work for the poor, a lot of charitable work together. Then she starts this friendship with the Duke of Wellington, who knows a lot more about the world than Charles Dickens does. Practical money matters. Well, Charles Dickens, didn't like that too much, and took against the Duke of Wellington for alienating her affections. And eventually, Angela asked the Duke to marry her.
Yes, she did. And he cared a great deal for her. But he was, how old was he now? He was either in his 60s or 70s.
He was in his 70s.
Yeah.
And he said, I'm very flattered, but I'm old enough to be your grandfather. And really, I can do you more good as your great good friend than I ever could, as a husband. And, we'll get married. And before long, you'll be stuck with an, infirm, ill husband.
Yeah.
He'll die soon. So, no.
Yeah, he said the letter is like, even though I'm quite healthy and fit now, in a few years I won't be. So
Right.
don't waste yourself on a man who could be your grandfather. Sort of.
And I really think that he felt about her the way he felt about Priscilla Bergerich.
I get that too. Yeah.
Bergerich.
I have no idea how to pronounce that name.
Okay, that makes two. And Elizabeth Hay, his daughter-in-law.
Yeah, I have a feeling that Priscilla's last name is one of those ridiculous English,
like Bush
and Beaver, and and things like that. Yeah, so Worcester, and things like that. And it's probably got its own way of being said. So if we keep this in, if anybody in the comments knows how to pronounce it, carry on, tell us, because we don't know. But yes,
I think he really enjoyed that role.
Mm-hmm.
He really did.
I think he did too. And Priscilla, what's her name?
Wear your galoshes, Priscilla.
Exactly.
Don't leave the house without galoshes.
He loved being paternal to everybody except his own children. It could be said. Although I think his relationship with his sons bears more scrutiny than has been given, to be honest. But nevertheless, he had great relationships with a lot of his extended children. And
do you know the anecdote about Doro at Walmer Castle?
Is it the one where he says, "Imagine the Duke of Wellington being announced, and only I walk in"?
No. But every time that Wellington took up residence at Walmer, there was I don't think it's Dover Castle. I think there was another barracks nearby at the time. And all the officers, when they knew that the Duke was coming, would leave their card. And then after a few weeks, all the cards would be collected, and everybody who left a card would be invited to dinner at Walmer. So this one time, everybody got invited except Duro. And Duro said to him, "You've invited every other officer. You don't invite your own son?" He said, "Every other officer left their card. You didn't."
I do remember that now, yes. But it's just so...
It's so Wellington.
It's so Wellington.
It's so Wellington.
Yes. It's that strange thing where, a little bit like what we were saying at the very beginning, with Lady Shelley, he did expect you to know what to do and how he liked things to work, even though he would be incredibly friendly with you. But he did expect even his son to leave a card. That just meant he thought Duro doesn't want to come, basically.
Well, and speaking of Angela, there was that big brouhaha between he and her at Apsley House because she showed up one morning.
Oh, yes.
Which means like up to 1 p.m.
Mm-hmm.
And it prompted his servant to go and get him. And when the servant came in, the Duke was undressed, or he said naked.
Yes.
Now, I doubt he's standing there really naked.
Yeah.
Naked to him is, not fully dressed.
Mm-hmm.
So he got caught short, number one, which he didn't like.
Yeah.
And number two,
she was pestering him at that time. She was being a bit naggy on him, and he writes that he was getting a little fed up of it.
Right. But the point is that it was understood by men at the time, and should have been understood by women at the time, that the morning up till like 1 p.m. was for men to conduct business. So, from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. at Apsley House, if you had business with the Duke, or you wanted to speak to him on the off chance he had a minute for you, the men would, gentlemen would stop by the house to conduct business. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't a place for women to be seen, especially single women.
Mm-hmm. So she acted in a way that put him in an embarrassing situation and out of his daily schedule. And that annoyed him. So he was quite easy to annoy by our standards, although most of the people who annoyed him were actually acting in ways that at the time is kind of taking advantage of the fact you know him in a way. And I think that's probably one of the things that actually got him and particularly annoyed with with people like Angela when she just showed up at that time of day. And what we're saying.
This also brings up the question of the secret staircase at Stratfield Say.
Right. Yes.
Supposedly, he had a secret staircase built from his office downstairs with a stairway behind a hidden door up to her rooms above.
Right.
Well, you know what? After the anecdote I just told you, certainly all of his retinue at Stratfield Say at the time, Collins and whoever else, would know that these men are here constructing a secret staircase and where it leads to. Now, do you really think that Wellington would do that? I don't. It's out of character, because if nobody in the entire world knew, except for the people in the house, that was still enough for him to say no.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's way too I'm going to use the word artful, but it's way too sort of sneaky and clandestine and much too complicated to go to all the trouble of the expense and secrecy of building a secret staircase that would never be secret anyway.
Right.
When if he wanted to go and visit somebody secretly, he would just very plainly go secretly.
Tiptoe down the corridor.
Yeah. And that was more his style. If he wanted to go visit somebody in secret, he would just find a time that would be secret, that would be unobserved, and go and do it then.
If he didn't want his servant, I don't know if it was Collins or who it was, but if he didn't want him to see him naked, he certainly wouldn't want him to know what was going on in his bedroom.
Absolutely.
Am I right or wrong?
You are right. That is absolutely right. It just doesn't make any sense. If there is a secret stairway behind a wall in Stratfield Say, it's not for that reason. It's because it was originally built into the building by somebody else, and he had it in his office or something like that. It's about as much. It was
perfectly innocent.
Yeah, I think so. But that brings up some of the Duke's affairs. Now, as we've said, we don't give a lot of credence to most of the highly publicized affairs. You and me, we agree on this. Yes. We don't give a lot of credence to the what's the word I'm looking for?
Salacious?
Yes, that is exactly the word. Salacious rumors about people that he apparently had affairs with, because there's just not enough evidence to actually say he did, especially given that we know he just actually liked the company of women he could talk to. And that, however, does bring up the one woman who Elizabeth Longford says he to within a tiny margin of error, probably did have an affair with. And that is a woman called Mariana, is it?
Patterson.
Mariana Patterson.
And if not for her, we wouldn't have the iconic Lawrence portrait of Wellington.
Exactly. Every book ever written about the Duke of Wellington owes her a great deal.
Yeah. Every cover.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. The most recognizable portrait of Wellington is because he wanted her to have this portrait, I believe, or she asked for a portrait, and this is the one.
And he had one done of her at the same time.
Yes, which is in Stratfield Say. It's a very lovely portrait.
In the dining room.
It is.
Or it was during his time.
Mm-hmm.
And need I say, Kitty's time.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the marriage is a different video entirely, really, because we're talking about these other ladies. But yeah, everybody feels sorry for Kitty. But the portrait, unsubtle as it is, where it is and why it's there, is a very nice portrait. She was obviously a very lovely and graceful lady. In fact, she and her sisters were actually known as the Three Graces, I believe, when they first came from America.
Made a sensation.
Mm-hmm. I believe they're thought to be like, there's this thing about the American heiresses coming over later in the century to get aristocratic and noble husbands. They're thought to be some of the first people who ever did this, the Catton sisters. And why don't you give us a few stories about the Catton sisters and Marianne? Because they're fascinating people. They deserve a great. They're ready-made drama. They're very ready-made TV.
Ready-made drama, and whether he had an affair with her or not, which probably he did. I mean, the most mind-boggling part of that story is that she wound up married to his brother Richard.
I never understood that.
And he wrote to her because once their affair had cooled down, they kind of went their separate ways, Marianne and Wellington. Mm-hmm. And then shortly thereafter, she's with his brother and engaged to his brother and going to marry his brother. And Wellington wrote to her and said, "Ixnay on the marriage to Richard nay." He's in debt. He's a little, ungats. He's not quite there. There's a lot of things wrong with this picture. Don't marry him. And she did. And he said to her, he's in debt to many people. He's not financially sound. He's not emotionally sound. She went ahead and did it. And when Richard died, she was in a lot of debt. And the first person she wrote to was Wellington. And what she said to him was, because I've read the letter, it wasn't anything romantic or anything in the least. But she said, "I have so many debts and so many debt collectors at my door. Please see what you can do about the insurance money and hurry that along because I can use that to pay all our back bills." And he did. But what's funny is after this whole thing, when he says, "Don't marry my brother," he was one of the trustees on their marriage settlement. So
it's a funny thing.
I think, it might hark back to his wanting to protect the female.
Could be.
I can't think of any other reason for him to do it than say, at least this way she'll have somebody looking out for her.
Yeah.
Because I certainly can't leave it to Richard.
No, well, no, that's certainly true. I think Harriet Arbuthnot, because he unloaded all of this on her, his fury and frustration that she was going to marry Richard, and he knew Richard very well. He'd had dealings with Richard and money ever since he went running off with the French actress. And he was a flight risk. Yes, Hyacinth, who sadly died because not long after Waterloo, I think, in 1819 possibly. May have to edit that. Anyway, yes, he was a flight risk.
Wellington said, "I wish somebody would castrate him so he could keep his mind on business."
Exactly. And with Marianne, Elizabeth Longford says that she was one of the few women who could have made him happy in a marriage.
Well, what's funny is it's either Shelley or Arbuthnot. Off the top of my head, I can't remember. But she's walking in the garden with Wellington and says to him, "What the hell is the real story behind you marrying Kitty?" And he's, the answer. Everybody knows the answer. It's the most foolish thing I ever did in my life. But there's a very telling line in that when he says, well, by the time that, Olivia Sparrow, who should be slapped silly, by the time she raised this question and he got her initial letter saying, "You should renew your suit of Kitty," he says to Shelley or Arbuthnot, "And at the time, I was convinced that I would never be in love again and had to get married, so it might as well be her than anyone else." So, I mean, that's the thing.
Mm-hmm.
Who were you in love with before? Was it in India? Where was it? We don't know. But he does admit to having the love of his life before marrying Kitty. So we don't know.
Interesting. And I don't think anybody has come up with an answer to that. But Marianne was somebody he did seem to love. So one of his friends, another lady, I think again it was either Harriet Arbuthnot or Lady Shelley, actually said he's so in love with her. That is the strength. Actually, that's one of the strengths of why people think he did have an affair with her, because one of his close friends pretty much as much said it. But again, it comes into the Duke and the right thing to do. If he was Richard, he would have divorced Kitty or ran away with Marianne.
Yes.
The Duke of Wellington does not do that, even if it makes him unhappy.
Right.
He just eventually ends his affair with Marianne. And of course, Marianne isn't the entire story of the Cat and Sisters. There's
Louisa, her sister, who married Felton Hervey.
And they're connected. They're connected to Napoleon, aren't they? Through
his mother in New Jersey.
Yes.
Jerome.
Yes, through Jerome's ex-wife.
I know. Top of head's gonna explode.
But it's a fascinating little marriage link between Wellington and Napoleon through that. So look it up if you have time. We don't really have time to go into the intricacies of it because we are running out of time anyway. But who else do you think was important in the Duke's life?
I'm going to say Priscilla.
Yeah. Now, you don't hear a lot about Priscilla. You read a lot. If you read biographies of Wellington, you get things like his favorite niece. She was his niece, wasn't she, or something? Or was she his? Yes.
She was Wicked William's sister.
Yes. So she was his favorite.
What's interesting is at the Congress of Vienna, Priscilla Bergerish and her husband were there for a time. I think Henry was there for a time. Fitzroy Somerset was there for it. And somebody recorded that, we're at the Congress of Vienna, but actually we're at this huge family dinner.
Yeah.
In another place, in another country. And everybody all the circles came together where everybody was at this dinner at the same time. Mm-hmm. So,
but he doted on her, as we mentioned before. He was very fond of her, but you don't really hear a lot about her, except that he had great affection for her.
Well, I think we don't hear a lot about her because after a certain point, he gets posted in Constantinople or something, and they're gone for 16 years. So her letters to him in that intervening time have been published, but she's not on the scene, as it were, on the ground in London. She's, off somewhere.
Yeah, I think I remember something about him being very upset about this posting to Constantinople because it meant that he wouldn't be able to see her as much anymore.
Yes.
Apparently, when he went off to St. Petersburg to see the new Tsar and see the old Tsar die, because everybody thought he wasn't going to come back alive actually because he was a little sick when he left. In 1825.
It was just after one of his strokes.
I think so, yeah. And he cried when he said goodbye to his mother and Priscilla because he was afraid he wasn't going to see them again.
Right. And that's another thing, that out of context, he's only, good for fodder, cannon fodder or shot, whatever, that whole thing.
Food for powder.
But, there are letters from Lady Mornington, Wellington's mother, to various family members, primarily Richard, at the British Library. And they're very warm and loving letters. So it's, another thing, you've taken it out of context, and that one, You know,
I'm
that
suspicious.
line defines Lady Mornington for the centuries, which is
Yes,
unfair, I think.
I do as well. I think it's a great quote. You know, I think it's a wonderful, characterful little
Media
thing.
bite.
Yeah, and I don't doubt that she felt that way at the time, because at that time he was useless, and useless younger sons went to the army. And it's just as simple as that. She may not even have meant it the way people take it to be meant, because it's probably just a flowery way of saying he's going to have to go to the army, because that's all he's good for.
Right.
It's just what younger sons did. I would love to see a book about Anne Mornington, and someone to dig into her correspondence and things like that, to see how much truth there is in this cold, stern matron thing.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot made of that. Not even Longford argues with it. She argues for it, I think. I don't think Rory Moore argues against it either.
Well, I have photographs of the letters from the British Library. I haven't transcribed them yet, but I remember their contents, and it was totally at odds.
That would be fascinating to see, I think. I've often wanted, because she lived a ridiculously long time, and you don't hear about her again after these
And she's another one who got a grace and favor apartment at Hampton Court.
I mean, apparently she was even in Brussels on the eve of Waterloo. When he came back from Vienna, she was still in Brussels. She was in Brussels or something. She'd gone back to Brussels, I think. So I keep this little thing in the back of my mind. There's tons of little things in the back of my mind. Well, wouldn't it be interesting to read more about their relationship? Because nobody does. Nobody gives it the time of day after he comes back from Angers, and he says, "Oh," and she says to her friends, "Oh, what a difference there is in Arthur." You know. Yeah.
I'm just glad that we're doing this interview, because there's so much about Wellington that nobody knows, that gets overlooked. It's the same old chestnuts regurgitated.
Yeah.
All political stuff and the military stuff. And yes, it's more than stuff, granted. It's the meat of his life. But there was so much more to the man that, as I said, gets overlooked.
Absolutely. I would be fascinated as well to look into just his taste. His taste in music, food, art.
His taste in music, the Hanover rooms. What is the Hanover rooms for historic music or something?
One of those names.
One of those things. But you'd go to dinner at Apsley House.
Yeah.
And then you'd get dragged there, and it was ancient. It was ancient music, is what it was. And I think his father used to like that music. And that's why he would go. But it was like, oh my God, do we really have to? And so it was like the penance you had to pay for saying you had dinner. That you had to go afterwards to there and go.
Yeah. So there's tons of facets about his life that don't get looked into. And that's why it's so fun to do interviews like this. I think if we were going to also briefly talk about anybody, then another lady who crops up quite a bit towards the end of his life. And I'm not just talking about there's several. I mean, the other lady that almost supposedly married him is Miss Jenkins, I think, or something like that, a name like that. But I'm not talking about her. I'm thinking of someone a little bit more famous, Dorothea Levin, the wife of the Russian ambassador,
who everyone knew was a snake in the grass. So I mean, he never, not just Wellington, but everybody who had sense in their head knew where she was coming from and what she was about.
She's a fascinating person. If you look at her portrait, look at that portrait.
Oh my God, with the
look at the expression that she's giving Lawrence. It's a brilliant portrait.
What's that anecdote? They're at the Brighton Pavilion.
Yeah.
And the king gets a note from somebody.
I mean, she has some really good anecdotes, Dorothea Levin.
And so she says, not to the king, but to whoever's, maybe Mrs. Cunningham. What does it say? What does it say? And whoever the person she's asking had like enough of Dorothea Levin by now and says, "Hey, King, she wants to know what's in your letter." It was just such an open secret by that time, Gossipy wants to know what's going on again.
Yeah.
She was branded that way, so everybody treated her that way, telling her nothing, because they knew it would get back to Metternich or get back to her husband or God only knows who.
And in the book of Wellington and His Friends, it was edited by the 7th Duke of Wellington, he pretty much says that as opposed to the thousands of letters to Harriet Arbuthnot and the very warm letters to Angela, the letters to Dorothea Levin, and he wrote quite a few to her, I don't know, I think he kind of enjoyed the fact, I think he must have enjoyed her nosiness and him being able to kind of bat it away or something like that. But yeah, he doesn't.
But that brings up Georgina Lennox, the Duke of Richmond's daughter.
And perhaps a very
Wellington's dearest Georgie.
Wellington's dearest Georgie. Perhaps perhaps the most fitting lady to end this interview on, I think, is Georgie Lennox.
But he was, I think, 26 years older than her. And he had known her, since Ireland, when her father was Lord Lieutenant. And they grew up with the great Sir Arthur, So by the time she was, let's say, 18 and going to evening entertainments, they were still very good friends. And one of their favorite amusements would be to conjure up a lie at the beginning of the night, make up a false rumor. And then she'd go one way and tell somebody, and he'd go the other way and tell somebody. And then they just sat back to see how long it would take for all the people they told, "Don't tell a soul," for it to come back, and in what incarnation it would return to them. How embellished would it be by the time it got back to them? But the most important anecdote, if you will, about Georgie is that she was the last living person who had been at Waterloo, or in Brussels at the time of Waterloo, and at her mother's legendary ball. So we all know that there was the Waterloo dinner every year at Apsley House. Well, as the years went on, people died. Eventually, Wellington died. So there were no more, on Waterloo days, Waterloo dinners. So it devolved onto Georgie as the last person who had actually been there to carry that flame. And every Waterloo day, all the second generation Wellesleys and Pagets and all those people would come to her house in London and pay homage to her. And she had great fun taking all of her Wellington and Waterloo souvenirs and bringing them down to the drawing room and laying them out for the day so everybody could see. And even Queen Victoria, who, she couldn't make personal calls, but every year she sent Georgie flowers on the day. So that's what impresses me, is that she was the keeper of the flame until the last year of her life.
And that's why she's a good person to end it on, because Georgie, you get it encapsulates what we've just been talking about. Through these women, you get glimpses of the Duke of Wellington, and in that you get his very unguarded, playful side, which is absolutely there, and it shows him an utter relaxation with somebody he just gets along with so well, because he's known her since they were both young. Yeah. And that also adds a different layer to the Duchess of Richmond's ball. You'll see just unguarded quotes in books about him flirting with Lady Georgina Lennox. No, she was like his sister. She was one of his best friends, basically. Yes. And they would get up to all sorts of nonsense together.
Yeah, absolutely. Riding the coach.
Exactly. And right down to the end, where she became, I don't know, the stand-in for the Duke of Wellington, for the Waterloo veterans. Yes. And she used to meet them, I think, also in front of the statue in Hyde Park and things like that. On Waterloo Day, she would visit that for an impromptu sort of ceremony, I think,
Yeah.
and things like that. And so, yeah, that's why these women are very important to the story of the Duke of Wellington, important in their own right, but it's very interesting what they reveal about him as a person as well. And that's why, and it's been such a pleasure to talk to you about them tonight.
It's been fun for me too. I don't usually get to talk about the social side or the female side of Wellington, so it was great fun for me. Thank you.
Well, I don't get to talk about this side of him much either, and people should talk more about this side of him because, as he said himself, it is a bad thing to be always fighting.
Yes.
And most of his life was spent not fighting, and also a great deal of his life was spent, as we all spend it, trying to enjoy yourself, to distract yourself, and to have a good time with your friends.
Absolutely, most important thing.
That's the most important things. So thank you, Kristine, for talking to me tonight, being on the channel.
You, Josh. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for bringing us your excellent backdrop as well. We'll be looking forward to your book, which I've read and recommend right now, even though it's not out yet. But look out for it. Look out for it because it's going to be really good. So, in wrapping up, if you liked the video, please leave a comment, please subscribe, please like it. It's supposedly what I'm supposed to ask people to do at the end of videos, because apparently if I don't, you won't do it or something like that. I don't know. And I'm going to leave you with this thought, because everybody's feeling some pressure right now. The Duke knew a thing or two about pressure. And of the many things he said, he apparently once said that we should encourage in ourselves the spirit of gentlemen and soldiers. And therefore, dear friends, have courage and have compassion as you carry on. And we will see you again for another adventure in Historyland very soon, I hope.
Thank you.